World History of Christianity, Chapter 7, Part 3, page 266. Later Lutheranism and the Second Reformation. Luther's death in 1546 left Protestantism in his homeland perilously placed. True, half of Germany's princely states and a larger proportion of the free cities had now officially adopted Lutheranism. But against this, even Luther's supporters would concede that the Christian education of the mass of the population had scarcely begun. More worrying still, there were signs that the forces of the old church were beginning to revive. In 1544, Catholic armies forcibly prevented the Archbishop of Cologne, Hermann von Wied, from turning his lands into a secular Protestant state, a clear indication that the balance of military force was turning against the Protestant Smalkaldic League. And in 1546, the Emperor Charles V finally tired of negotiation and embarked on the forced subjugation of the Lutheran princes. A short military campaign succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, when the crushing victory at Mulberg left the leading Protestant princes as prisoners in his hands. Able now to dictate terms, Charles insisted on a harsh religious settlement, the Augsburg Interim, which presaged the reintroduction of a Catholic order of service throughout the empire. Happily for German Lutheranism, this crisis was short-lived. The emperor's military advantage proved to be only temporary, and within a few years a sharp turn in the strategic balance forced him to contemplate a more realistic settlement of Germany's religious stalemate. Exhausted and discouraged in 1555, Charles V retired from active political life, leaving his brother Ferdinand to make the concessions to German Protestantism that were now inevitable. The Peace of Augsburg, signed in 1555, was a landmark settlement, justly recognized as such by both contemporaries and historians. For the first time, the Lutheran churches of Germany received official recognition. In lands where the prince or city council had formally adopted the Reformation, Lutheran churches were now formally acknowledged, the principle known as cuius regio, ius religio. In this respect, the peace signaled the formal end of attempts, by force or by consensus, to bring an end to the confessional divide in Germany. But Germany's Protestants paid a price for their hard-won security, for the peace also laid down that those lands which remained in Catholic hands should equally be respected. In terms of territorial gains, German Lutheranism made little further progress in the half-century after 1555. Even more importantly, the Peace of Augsburg made no provision for other Protestant confessions to enjoy its protections. This was highly significant because in Germany, as in Western Europe, Calvin's church system exercised a strong dynamic pull. Cities and territories which flirted with the Swiss movement in these decades did so without the protection of the provisions of the peace. This omission became almost immediately a matter of some importance when in 1559 the new Elector Palatine Frederick III began moving his lands, Protestant since 1546, towards a reformed confession. With the Palatinate and especially the University of Heidelberg as a focal point, Calvinism proved to be a strong influence for change within the empire, particularly in the years after 1580. In the 2 decades at the end of the century, a whole series of cities and small territories professed the Reformed religion, most concentrated in the same strategic theater of northwestern Germany and Westphalia. Together with the Palatinate, these lands provided the ideal jumping-off point for intervention in the religious conflicts raging in the lands to the west, a phenomenon epitomized in the career of Count John Casimir, younger brother of the Elector Frederick, who actively pursued the role of international Protestant champion by leading a sequence of military expeditions into France and the Low Countries. The strong dynamic growth in German Calvinism after 1580 was partly a result of developments within German Lutheranism. For some time after the Peace of Augsburg, German Lutheranism had remained relatively fluid, but conflicting strains were already beginning to emerge, their origin dating back to the difficult years after Charles V's victory at Mulberg. Faced with the emperor's overwhelming victory, a significant proportion of the Lutheran leadership had urged compromise. Among them, Luther's lieutenant and heir, Philip Melanchthon. Such lack of resolution had outraged those who favored resistance at whatever cost. Charles's eventual retreat from Germany seemed to have vindicated this position. Not surprisingly, those who had opposed any compromise regarded themselves as the true heirs of Luther. Strongly entrenched in the universities of Tübingen and Jena, they took refuge in an ever more rigid defense of Lutheran orthodoxy and ever more virulent denunciations of those who deviated from this demanding standard. The difficulties posed by such a hardening of the confessional fronts were amply demonstrated by the later career of Philip Melanchthon, since Luther's death undoubtedly the most illustrious voice of German Lutheranism. Melanchthon's accommodating spirit was little suited to the world of uncompromising factional polemics that had erupted in the empire since 1550. Those who followed Melanchthon in these controversies, the Philippists, were mostly men of the same stamp, jurists, physicians, and theologians, awfully strongly influenced by Erasmian humanism, and well represented in the University of Wittenberg. The decisive showdown within German Lutheranism occurred as the result of developments within electoral Saxony. For much of his long reign, the Elector Augustus tolerated both tendencies in his lands. A coterie of Philippists at his court was balanced by a strongly orthodox clergy and nobility. In 1574, provoked by the publication of a pamphlet openly espousing Calvinist Eucharist theology, the Orthodox persuaded Augustus to purge his court. A number of the leading Philippists were arrested and imprisoned, and some even tortured. A major exodus followed. In the wake of these dramatic events, Elector Augustus encouraged Orthodox theologians to articulate a clear statement of Lutheran doctrine. The Formula of Concord, proclaimed in 1580 and widely accepted as the new creedal statement in Lutheran churches across Germany, established hard-line Gnezio-Lutheranism as the undisputedly dominant tendency within the German churches. The expulsion of the Philippists did not arrest the development of German Calvinism, but these events did ensure that the major German princely states would remain true to their Lutheran heritage. When in 1613 the Elector of Brandenburg, Johann Sigismund, announced a personal conversion to Calvinism, there was no question that his subjects would obediently follow. Calvinism in Brandenburg remained almost entirely confined to the ducal court. Events such as these demonstrated that in the long decades since Luther's preaching, his movement had put down deep roots. In the second half of the 16th century, most of the German princes continued the work of consolidating their authority within their dominions, a process to which the defiance of the emperor's will in the early Reformation had given a decisive impulse. In this process, the Lutheran pastors were to emerge as vital allies, as local agents and upholders of the princely authority. In return, the German princes were careful to defend and enhance the prestige of the ministerial office. Thus, the Lutheran pastorate became an increasingly attractive and professionalized occupation as the century wore on. Trained in state-supported colleges and universities, Ministers became a new force in the local community, dominating the village through their social prestige and superior education. The new ministerial family became the natural focus of village life to an even greater extent than had their priestly predecessors in the pre-Reformation period. This process, often referred to as confessionalization, was not unique to the Lutheran Church. The same process of professional development and close cooperation with the state power was evident in Calvinism and Catholic lands in this period also. And Luther in Germany, notwithstanding these real advances, would pay a heavy price for the divisions which had preceded the resolution of the theological disputes in the 1580s. The strong passions raised inevitably turned the movement inwards. Preoccupied by their own affairs, the German churches had little appetite for a leadership role in the wider Protestant community. In the second half of the century, this leadership role therefore devolved increasingly on the other major emerging Protestant power, England. Elizabethan England was in many respects an unlikely and certainly reluctant champion of the international Protestant cause. In 1558, Elizabeth had acceded to a troubled throne, after 5 years during which Catholicism had been re-established in England with little apparent difficulty. Although the changes of Mary's reign were now reversed once more, Elizabeth and her counselors were under no illusions that many of her subjects remained obstinately attached to the old ways. It would be well into the last 2 decades of Elizabeth's long reign before it could confidently be said that Protestantism was the religion of the majority in England. For the first decades, those who opposed the religious policies of the Elizabethan government could take comfort from the evident insecurity of a regime embodied by a mature, childless queen who obstinately refused to marry, and whose nearest heir was the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots. Had Elizabeth died early, as she nearly did in 1563 from smallpox, England too might have plunged into the same religious civil war convulsing neighboring lands on the continent. Given this evident insecurity, the confidence with which Elizabeth and her advisers addressed the complicated problems of domestic and foreign policy arising from a new restoration of Protestantism was remarkable. A parliament gathered to settle religion in 1559 compliantly reinstated the Protestant prayer book of Edward VI, but Elizabeth balked at the introduction of the full Calvinist church order urged upon her by foreign theologians and some of the English exiles who, having withdrawn to the continent during Mary's reign, now returned to inaugurate the new era. Bishops were retrained, and so too ecclesiastical vestments, which many of the hotter Protestants regarded as an unacceptable popish survival. When in 1566 Elizabeth insisted upon uniformity in clerical attire, a substantial proportion of the English clergy, up to 10% in London, refused to submit and were deprived. Further attempts to move the Queen to a more perfect reformation, whether by parliamentary statute or subtle pressure through the bench of bishops, proved equally unavailing. The Church of England would remain, in the words of its Protestant critics, but halfly reformed. Despairing at the Queen's obstinacy and at the apparent indifference of broad sections of the population to the call to a more godly lifestyle, evangelicals took refuge in brotherhoods and congregations which became increasingly detached from the mainstream church. The frustration of reform measures in the parliaments of 1571 and 1572 led some into formal separation. In the latter years of Elizabeth's reign, Puritanism gave way to sectarian nonconformity, and eventually into outright confrontation with the established church. But the numbers involved in such open dissidence were small, the vast majority of the godly preferring to remain in communion and seek consolation in voluntary associations which provided an appropriate context for the Puritan lifestyle. And in the main, their choice was justified, for whatever their disappointment at Elizabeth's lack of godly zeal, England's general alliance to the Protestant cause was not in doubt. Even from the beginning of the reign, there were evident proofs of this in an ambitious foreign policy which led swiftly to confrontation with the leading Catholic powers. By the last quarter of the century, England was destined to play a pivotal role in the survival of Calvinist powers on the continent, as they faced the most profound threat to their survival from a resurgent Catholicism. Catholic Reform. Catholic reform was not a product of Protestantism. Long before Luther's protest divided the German church, a coherent agenda of reform was already in place. The renewal of worship and church institutions had been pursued with vision and energy by church leaders in several parts of Europe since the middle of the 15th century. In the Spain of Ferdinand and Isabella, Cardinal Ximenes de Cisneros had introduced a series of reforms which anticipated by the best part of a century the reforming agenda of the Council of Trent, and notable Italians, such as Bishop Ghiberti of Verona, appointed in 1524, followed suit. With such examples in mind, Catholic historians have rejected with indignation the use of the term Counter-Reformation to describe a movement whose roots lay deep in the medieval era. Luther, they remind us, was by no means the first or most influential Catholic reformer of his day. Nevertheless, there is no denying that the emergence of Protestantism provided an enormous stimulus to the process of reform. The reform of church structures and established patterns of belief had proved an arduous undertaking, and for every Cisneros in early 16th century Europe, there were a dozen bishops who owed their position to family influence or royal patronage, rather than any intrinsic fitness for office. The eruption of criticism of the Church, spreading from Germany in the 1520s, pressed reform to the top of the agenda, if only because it demonstrated that if the hierarchy proved unequal to the task, others within the Christian community were now wholly determined on a renovation of church life and institutions. The problem for the Church was that reform could only really come from the top. The medieval conflict over conciliarism had eventually been resolved by reaffirming papal authority, but the papacy had also saddled itself with the responsibility for initiating reform. In the early 16th century, the institution faced a double challenge: to confront and throw back the threat posed by Luther's movement, while at the same time meeting the concerns of those who acknowledged the need for fundamental reform within the established church. It was hardly surprising that at times during the first years of Protestantism, such a task seemed almost beyond a papacy assailed by both friend and foe alike. In the first years after Luther's protest, there was considerable disagreement as to how much could be conceded to the Church's critics. Luther was a heretic, but were his theological propositions equally heretical? Many, even within the higher reaches of the Roman hierarchy, were deeply attracted to Luther's teaching on justification, which drew on a strong tradition of thought within Catholicism. Gasparo Contarini, the leading representative of this tendency and a cardinal from 1535, is believed to have reached his understanding of justification prior to and independent of Luther. It inevitably took some time for the Renaissance papacy to adapt to the new scale of the challenge posed by evangelism. Only when the traditional weapons of ban and excommunication had been tried and failed was it finally recognized that a fundamental review of Catholic doctrine was necessary if the old church were to survive. The chosen instrument of reform was a general council of the church, summoned after years of negotiation and hesitation to meet at Trent in northern Italy in 1545. The hesitation reflected deep misgivings regarding the merits of such an open assembly, and prolonged dispute between Pope and Emperor over the council's location. But in some respects, the delays were critical to the council's undoubted success, because by the time the council met, the critical doctrinal questions in relation to Protestantism had effectively been resolved. The half-decade before Trent had seen a series of meetings designed to promote reconciliation between the divided confessions. The most serious of these, a conference of German and Italian theologians at Regensburg in 1540, revealed that the theological gulf between Lutherans and Catholics was now unbridgeable. The council which gathered at Trent was not therefore intended to promote reconciliation with Protestantism. Rather, its purpose was to declare Catholic orthodoxy on matters where Protestants clearly deviated from traditional teaching. This purpose is clearly indicated by the resulting theological canons of the council, which declared the validity of the Catholic tradition entirely in relation to institutions and customs challenged by evangelicals. The validity of pilgrimages, images, and prayers to saints were affirmed, the doctrine of transubstantiation confirmed, the value of church authority proclaimed against an exclusive reliance on Scripture. The doctrinal pronouncements of the Council of Trent, substantially complete by the end of its first two sessions, were essential to the Catholic revival in Europe. After decades of debate and doubt as to what constituted the essentials of faith, Trent established clarity in the areas of doctrine and church practice most disputed between reformers and conservatives. These matters once settled, it allowed the fathers of the church to draw a clear distinction between the heretical assault on church doctrine and the call for renovation of the church's institutions and improvement in standards of clerical performance, which all shades of Christian denomination recognized had some validity. The reform of the church's institutions dominated the council's later deliberations, which eventually, after several recesses, stretched over 20 years. Here, too, the council's provisions reflected the impact of the evangelical agenda. Some of the most important of the council's decisions in this area recognized the necessity that the clergy should be properly qualified and worthy of respect. Scandalous and ignorant clergy had been one of the most provocative issues in the eyes of many of the laity who had joined the evangelical movement. In response, Trent laid down clear provisions for the training, residence, and moral direction of the clergy. To ensure a future supply of adequately educated men, each diocese was to establish a seminary. But the fathers at Trent were careful to do nothing to disturb the traditional hierarchical structures of the church. The authority of a bishop in his diocese was confirmed, and the council was at pains to do nothing to undermine the authority of the papal see. The reform of the curia, widely recognized as essential, was left to the initiative of a series of reforming popes, notably Paul III, 1534 through 49, and Paul IV, 1555 through 59, inspired but in no way directed by Trent. The reforms of parish life, anticipated by the council, took decades, even centuries, to be carried into effect. The establishment of diocesan seminaries proceeded only at a slow pace, and by the end of the 16th century, many priests were still woefully badly educated. And whilst notable bishops such as Archbishop Charles Borromeo of Milan, 1560 through 84, took up the reforming agenda with exemplary zeal, in the broader mass of the episcopate, old habits died hard. Many continued to treat episcopal office as a family property. 4 successive members of the Gondi family held the Archdiocese of Paris between 1559 and 1662. It was by such a process that Richelieu first attained high office when he was promoted to the family diocese. For others, church positions continued to be held in plurality, or as the adjunct to royal service. Small wonder that the effects of the council's decrees were often scarcely felt at parish level. Historians of Protestantism now recognize that the evangelical program needed many generations to achieve a substantial reordering of fundamental religious beliefs, and this seems equally to have been the case for Catholicism. Studies of local Catholic culture, published in recent years, demonstrate that in many parts of Europe, parishioners remained addicted to religious customs that were essentially pre-Reformation in character or even semi-pagan. The wiser, more experienced members of the local church hierarchy frequently accommodated themselves to such local customs in their application of the canons of reform. But all of this is not to say that the impact of Trent was not immediate or profound. Probably the council's first effect was psychological. The promulgation of its decrees, backed by clear evidence of a will to reform in the papacy, restored self-confidence to a battered movement and, just as important, a sense of mission. This was reflected in a new willingness on the part of a committed Catholic laity to oppose and confront further Protestant encroachment. Among the religious professionals, the most striking manifestation of this phenomenon was the foundation and spectacular growth of the new religious orders. The best known of the orders was the Society of Jesus, or Jesuits, founded in 1540 by the former soldier Ignatius Loyola. The saintly piety and organizational flair of their founder, combined with an ostentatious devotion to the papal office, assured the Jesuits of crucial political patronage. Thanks to their rigorous educational program and a stream of high-quality recruits, the Jesuits were able to turn themselves into a veritable missionary elite. But the Jesuits were by no means the first nor the largest of the new orders. The Theatines, 1524, Ursuline nuns, 1535, and Oratorians all played their part in the new religious life of mission activity, as did the Capuchins and Reformed Cistercians. Together they accomplished what amounted to a wholesale renovation of the jaded monasticism of the Middle Ages. The new religious orders achieved their most spectacular successes overseas, in the mission fields of the New World and Asia. Here, their strenuous and often heroic efforts were relatively uncontroversial. These were virgin territories for Christianity, with souls to claim in their millions. The fathers gave themselves to this work with a zeal which was for a time proof against doubts regarding the real chances of bringing native peoples to a profound understanding of Christianity. The Augustinians were in Mexico by 1533 and Peru by 1550. For the Jesuits, Francis Xavier, Loyola's most charismatic lieutenant, wore out his life in repeated voyages around the eastern oceans, among his many achievements opening up China and Japan to Christian influence. This was dangerous work, and many of the missionaries gave their lives to the cause. But this was hardly a useless sacrifice, since the example of these noble martyr saints gave Catholics exemplars to set against the many evangelicals who had given their lives bravely and without complaint in the defense of their beliefs. The Counter-Reformation, indeed, was an age of new saint-making. 27 men and 5 women who lived during these centuries were canonized by the Church before 1770, a clear sign of the Church's desire to promote new models of emulation, to set alongside the more various and sometimes largely mythical saints of the medieval Christian tradition. For succeeding generations, the mission churches would pose more difficult questions. European superiors with no experience of native societies were increasingly troubled by the extent to which missionaries were prepared to temper their presentation of Christian teaching to make it more comprehensible to local civilizations. Few, it must be said, shared modern scruples at the havoc wreaked on advanced and sophisticated native societies by the introduction of Western mores and social custom. For European Catholicism, however, the impact of the overseas missions was an almost unqualified success. For their effort in restoring the self-confidence of a bruised and battered church, the missions were quite irreplaceable. At a basic level, the millions of new souls won overseas offered a partial compensation for those lost to Protestantism at home. The overseas missions also offered the opportunity for immediate action at a time when the problems of Christian Europe seemed more intractable. The impact of the new religious orders on the collective religious psyche of Catholicism is revealed when it is recognized that a full half of the new saints of the Catholic Reformation were members of the new religious orders. These included 5 Capuchins, 3 Theatines, and no fewer than 6 Jesuits. Many of these saints had been active in the missions. Alongside Francis Xavier, Jesuit apostle to the east, were the Spanish observant Francisco Solano and the Dominican Louis Bertrand, 16th century missionary to the Indians of Colombia. But the mission field of the new religious orders was not confined to native peoples in faraway places. Among those canonized by a grateful papacy were the Jesuit Jean-François Régis, who labored to recover souls lost to Protestantism in Languedoc, and Felix of Sigmaringen, who did similar work in the Swiss Grisons. For while Catholics celebrated and honored the work of their overseas missionaries, few would doubt that the most critical task was to combat the apparently inexorable spread of Protestantism in Europe. And here too, the most immediate consequence of the Council of Trent lay less in specific reforming decrees than in its contribution to restoring Catholic self-confidence. In the 1560s, French Catholicism found individuals and groups prepared to engage the apparently rampant Huguenot bands with equal fervor and determination. France, in fact, witnessed at this time an extraordinary growth of voluntary religious associations on both sides of the religious divide. The greatest of the Catholic associations was the Catholic League, formed in 1584 to oppose the succession of the Huguenot Henry of Navarre after the death of the last Valois heir. At the end of the decade, the League would defy 2 monarchs to seize the capital, Paris, and establish it as a stronghold of unyielding opposition to the Huguenot succession. There is little doubt that this resurgent lay Catholicism proceeded in advance of any officially inspired renovation of religious life. Even by the end of the century, there were fewer than 300 Jesuits in France, and generally the French bishops had not as yet shown themselves active in the promotion of the counter-Reformation agenda. French Catholicism survived through a successful alliance between committed elements of the Catholic laity and the leadership provided by the Catholic nobility, notably the family of Guise. At a time when the French crown was contemplating permitting Protestant freedom of worship as a means of putting an end to religious conflict, this carefully crafted compromise was effectively destroyed by popular opposition. Events in France were a salutary reminder that for all the careful work of Trent, Catholic revival was first and foremost dependent on arresting the seemingly inexorable spread of Protestantism. As much as it revered and sanctified its missionaries and ascetics, Tridentine Catholicism owed an even greater debt to its men of war. The first phase of Catholic recovery is epitomized by the careers of successive Dukes of Guise, both of whom would have their careers as leaders of the French Catholic armies cut short by assassination, or the Duke of Parma, whose military campaigns in the Netherlands between 1579 and 1585 recovered for Catholic Spain most of the southern Netherlands. Lying behind much of this martial activity was the somber figure of the Spanish king Philip II, a man who more than any other embodied this phase of the militant Catholic struggle. Fiercely committed to both the crusade against the Ottoman Turk in the eastern Mediterranean and the battle against heresy in Western Europe, Philip made a clear identification between his global political mission and the struggle against Protestantism. "You may assure His Holiness," Philip told his ambassador in Rome in 1566, "that rather than suffer the least damage to religion and the service of God, I would lose all my states and 100 lives. if I had them, for I do not propose nor desire to be the ruler of heretics. Philip's Catholic allies were sometimes less convinced of the purity of the king's motives. The King of Spain, as a temporal sovereign, is anxious above all to increase his dominions. The preservation of the Catholic religion, which is the principal aim of the Pope, is only a pretext for his majesty, was the somewhat more cynical response of Sixtus V, 1585 through 93, Philip's sometimes reluctant partner in the enterprise of England. But for all these misgivings, it must be said that Philip's ventures did more than any other to turn the tide in favor of Catholicism. Between 1559 and 1571, Philip almost single-handedly gathered a coalition of forces capable of confronting the Turk in the Mediterranean, an initiative rewarded with the crushing naval victory at Lepanto in 1571, the greatest Christian victory of the 16th century. Thus encouraged, in the second half of his reign, Philip turned his attention to the problems of heresy in northern Europe. The wealth of the New World was poured out in successive campaigns to turn back the rebels in the Netherlands, to shore up the Catholic League in France, and finally, in the Armada campaign of 1588, to strike down Elizabeth of England, now in Philip's mind identified as the principal support of continental heresy. The failure of the Armada campaign was a setback from which Philip's grand strategic plan never recovered. But there is little doubt that for all his eventual disappointment, his application of military force had put a crucial brake on the growth of Protestantism. The leadership of the Catholic princes, not just Philip, but his Habsburg cousins in Germany, and lesser lights such as Maximilian of Bavaria, had provided Catholicism with a vital breathing space. In the next generation, reforming churchmen and their allies in the religious orders could begin the serious work of rebuilding the faith in areas of Europe where the prospects of survival had at one point seemed extremely bleak. Even by the turn of the century, the fruits of these efforts could be discerned. In Poland, where the monarchy had, since the accession of King Stefan Batory, 1576, become a staunch supporter of the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic recovery was remarkable after a generation in which Protestantism of all hues had made deep inroads. Most significant of all was the Catholic recovery in France. So secure was the Catholic ascendancy by the last decade of the century that the Huguenot Henry of Navarre saw no way to secure his inheritance other than to announce his conversion to Catholicism. For the religious conflict in Europe, it was a signal and telling moment. The 17th century and the resolution of the Reformation conflict. There is little doubt that Henry IV of France did more than anyone else both to bring an end to religious conflict and to promote the revival of Catholicism within his realm. Despite the skepticism of his former enemies, Henry clearly took his obligations to his new Catholic faith seriously, and he swiftly emerged as a highly effective exponent of Catholic revival. Following his reconciliation to Rome in 1594 and the end of the religious wars 4 years later, Henry took a number of measures to rebuild the faith, even going so far as to readmit to France his old adversaries, the Jesuits, in 1603. But in 1610, he was struck down by a Catholic assassin, a salutary warning that the wounds caused by 2 generations of religious conflict could not be easily healed. The attack that cost Henry IV his life was the 25th assassination attempt of his 20-year reign. Nothing illustrates more effectively the extent to which normal political loyalties had been confused by the poisonous confessional politics of the later 16th century. It would be many decades before such tensions were wholly dissipated, and genuine toleration between rival confessions was still centuries away. In this era, those who advocated religious toleration as a point of principle, such as the Dutch humanist Dirk Courgeert, were very much the exception. But as the century wore on, Catholics and Protestants in Europe were at least able to advance to a sort of grudging coexistence. The pace of change varied according to internal political circumstances, but by the century's end, a genuine change had been accomplished. Relations between states were now dominated almost wholly by strategic considerations, and hardly at all by the religious solidarity that underpinned the great confessional alliances of the age of religious wars. And while bigotry and religious hatred remained widespread, by the end of the 17th century, the execution of an individual for dissident religious beliefs had become sufficiently rare to be a notorious and somewhat shocking event. The fires of official justice and popular prejudice burned to consume witches rather than heretics. In this, as in so much else in the 17th century, the new Dutch Republic led the way. By the end of the 16th century, the division of the Netherlands into a free Protestant north and a group of southern provinces which remained under Spanish rule was effectively acknowledged on both sides. It would not be until 1648 that Spain formally conceded the Dutch their freedom, but long before this the conflict had lost its ideological edge, pursued on both sides more for commercial than for religious reasons. Most of all, the continuing commercial embargo between the two parts of the Netherlands allowed the Catholic South to recover some of the economic ground lost to the North and establish its own identity as a separate Catholic state. In this it was greatly assisted by a great flowering of Catholic devotional art, defiantly different from the austere traditions of the Calvinist Dutch Republic. The brilliant altarpieces commissioned from Rubens, Van Dyck, and Jacob Jordaens epitomized a new religious culture which celebrated the restored self-confidence of Catholic society. This newfound confidence was a notable feature of Catholic art in several parts of Europe. Both religious painting and the decorative arts enjoyed an enormous popularity during this period, under the energetic patronage of both Catholic princes and the leaders of the Church, as each sought to outdo the other in an ostentatious piety designed for the glorification of God. It also permitted the Church to erase the memory of the damage done to the fabric of religious life by the Protestant assault on the outward appearance of Catholic worship. In the Dutch Republic itself, the large and mainly quiescent Catholic minority achieved a high level of de facto toleration. Dutch Calvinists seemed to reserve their most bitter hatreds for each other. To judge by the prolonged and brutal conflict between Orthodox Calvinists and the followers of the Amsterdam professor Jacobus Arminius, whose unorthodox teaching on predestination brought the young nation to the brink of civil war in the second decade of the 17th century. The reverberations of this conflict were also felt in England, where the new century had brought a new dynasty impatient with Puritanism and keen to assert its own royal prerogatives over both church and state. The tensions remained under control during the reign of James I, 1603 through 25, but the evident admiration of his son Charles I for continental and largely Catholic theories of kingship could not but worsen relations with those parts of the political nation determined to defend both the prerogatives of Parliament and the Protestant settlement. The part that religious tensions may have played in bringing about the eventual conflict between king and Parliament is complex, but it is without doubt that the sense that Charles and his Catholic wife, Henrietta Maria, posed a dire threat to England's Protestant heritage was the crucial factor which drove many into the parliamentary camp. The man who emerged as Charles's most formidable opponent, Oliver Cromwell, was a dour and committed Calvinist, dangerously convinced of his own vocation to abolish tyranny. The convictions which led Cromwell to establish a government every bit as autocratic as the monarchy he had destroyed brought its own backlash, and the repudiation of Cromwell's joyless republic. But if Cromwell's regime did not long survive his death, the tumultuous events of this period had confirmed that Protestantism was at least as valued a part of English life as its parliamentary heritage. Kings would meddle with either at their peril, as James II would discover when his short-lived attempt to promote toleration of his own Catholic beliefs, brought only his deposition, 1688. Events in England epitomized one of the leading characteristics of the 17th century, that although religious persecution was largely a thing of the past, religious convictions were still sufficiently deeply felt to play a vital part in political decision-making. Kings and rulers would meddle with the established confessional identity of their lands at their peril. Nowhere was this more evident than in the German Empire, still the fulcrum of religious conflict a century after Luther first ignited the Reformation conflict. For all the comparative calm of relations between the confessions in the decades after the Peace of Augsburg, tension simmered below the surface. Reviving Catholic fortunes, together with a complicated succession crisis within the ruling Habsburg dynasty, finally brought an end to the uneasy peace, sparking the great pan-European struggle known as the 30 Years' War. Incubated in a steady worsening of relations between the religious confessions in the empire in the first decades of the new century, the conflict sprang to life in 1618 as the thoroughly Protestantized Bohemian estates sought to avoid the succession of the new Habsburg Emperor Ferdinand, for whom Bohemia formed a part of his hereditary lands. In his place they elected Frederick, Elector Palatine, leading representative of German Calvinism. This confusion of the religious politics of the Eastern and Western Empire inevitably led to decisive action on the part of the Habsburgs to enforce their rights. A swift military campaign put an end to the revolt. Frederick was deposed and stripped for good measure of his electoral title. The punishment of the rebel Bohemian nobility was the deprivation of their lands and their replacement with more amenable Catholic clients. The intervention of new protagonists, notably Luther in Sweden, prevented the Habsburgs from forcing home their advantage as the war spread into new areas of the empire. As the years went by, the conflict inevitably lost some of its original clarity of purpose, particularly after the intervention of Catholic France on the Protestant side in a traditional anti-Habsburg role. But the eventual peace settlement, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, did provide a significant resolution of outstanding religious differences. Uniquely in these negotiations, Catholic and Protestant delegates met in different locations, Munster and Osnabrück. The 30 Years' War would also be the last occasion on which a general European war would be fought with religion as one of the primary motivating forces. Hereafter, the rival confessions, now both settled in their own separate identities, would continue to evolve, often in parallel, but manifestly apart. For all that, the 30 Years' War undoubtedly offered confirmation that Catholicism was once again the more vibrant force in Western Christianity. The Habsburg victory in the first phase of the conflict had permitted the reclamation for the faith of both Bohemia and Hungary, lands where Protestantism had previously enjoyed an unchallenged dominance. In the 17th century, Poland also witnessed a steady erosion of the previously healthy Protestant churches. It was in this century that the Polish people first established the identification between Catholicism and their sense of Polish nationhood, which was to prove so remarkably enduring. Only the intervention on the anti-Habsburg side of another major power, France, had prevented a total Habsburg triumph, a sure sign that international relations were finally becoming decoupled from confessional considerations. The decision to revert to France's traditional anti-Habsburg foreign policy was sufficiently momentous to cause much controversy within French governing circles. It was the triumph of the new Bourbon dynasty and of their ministers, Cardinals Richelieu and Mazarin, that they could combine such alliances with Protestants and the Turk abroad with steadfast support for the Catholic Church within France. Not all French Catholics could comprehend such a policy any more than could the Pope, But for Louis XIV, the great Sun King, these were the twin pillars of France's new dominance of European politics. For 50 years, Louis pursued a policy of unremitting hostility to the Habsburg monarchies, combined with a steadily mounting pressure on his own Protestant subjects. This reached its climax in 1685 with the ceremonial revocation of the Edict of Nantes, the settlement which, by guaranteeing Protestant freedom of worship, had ended the French wars of religion. Those who would not convert were given 3 months to leave the kingdom, and over 100,000 of Louis's subjects chose to do so. Louis XIV intended the revocation of the Edict of Nantes as a triumphant reassertion of France's Catholic identity, but the expulsion of a community universally recognized as hardworking and peaceable was by this point something of an anachronism, a throwback to a more turbulent age. Other towns and nations in Europe were only too happy to welcome the Huguenots, and the loss to the French economy confirmed Louis's decision as a rash and in many respects counterproductive gesture. By the 18th century, those Protestants who remained in France had achieved the same grudging toleration that was the lot of religious minorities everywhere. As the years went by, even those on the margins of Christian society, traditionally persecuted by all of the main churches, were largely free from active persecution. To the extent that Christians had finally abandoned the attempt to convert their neighbors by coercion, the era of the Reformation conflicts was finally at an end. This ends chapter 7.